Murder, mass rape, torture and forced imprisonment. The UN documents a catalogue of gross human rights abuses in South Sudan. It says all sides have committed atrocities that could amount to war crimes. So how to stop the violence in South Sudan? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. It's a startling picture of state-sponsored atrocities in South Sudan. The UN Human Rights Office has documented in often excruciating detail cases of extreme brutality by government forces across the country last year. The level of sexual violence is perhaps the most shocking. Some women and girls were raped by 10 men or more, and the UN recorded more than 1,300 reports of rape in a single state. Though some of the violence is attributed to general lawlessness, the UN says abuses were committed with impunity and served to punish and instill terror in civilian communities. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Al Jazeera's Charles Stratford.
The suffering of people in the world's newest country defies belief. A report put together by the UN Human Rights Office goes into details of atrocities committed in South Sudan since the conflict began in December 2013. It says both sides are responsible, but government forces were most to blame last year. Between April and September, the UN recorded more than 1,300 reports of rape in just one of South Sudan's states, the oil-rich Unity State. The report says credible sources indicate that government forces are being allowed to rape women as a type of payment. One woman told the UN team she had been stripped naked, raped by 5 soldiers in front of her children on the roadside, then raped again by more men in the bushes, only to return and find her children missing. The report says the gravity of the violence may amount to war crimes and/or crimes against humanity. The government has denied the accusations.
If there are individuals, soldiers that comes out to violate human rights, then they are doing it at their own perils because the government doesn't authorize anybody to kill civilians.
The conflict began as a dispute between President Salva Kiir and his former deputy, Riek Machar, and it quickly turned into an armed rebellion. Last August, we met Machar in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa during a peace conference, and we asked him if he were willing to cooperate with an international investigation.
Anybody who has committed atrocities will be brought to book.
The report details evidence of entire towns and villages being destroyed in what it describes as a scorched earth policy. Around 2 million people have been forced to flee from their homes. The UN says hundreds of children have been recruited as child soldiers. It says journalists, human rights and aid workers suffer threats, detention, and in some cases have been murdered. Last August, both sides agreed to establish a transitional government of national unity. Both sides agreed to stop fighting. That still hasn't happened, and the suffering of millions of people continues. Charles Stratford, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. In Juba, we have Ateny, South Sudan Presidency Spokesman. In London, Mike Lewis, Lead Investigator for Conflict Armament Research. And in Geneva, Rupert Colville, Spokesman for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Welcome to you all. Let's start with Rupert Colville. Many have said that this, in a way, was a forgotten conflict, but this report has thrown very sharp focus again on South Sudan. Was this intentional?
Well, we were asked to produce this report by the Human Rights Council. That's a body of 47 states meeting here in Geneva. So, they were already alerted to the situation being very bad in South Sudan, and that's why they requested us to do this investigation and produce this report.
Ateny, what is your government's immediate response to this report?
Yes, we got the report and we condemned any act that is leading to human rights violations, no matter who has committed that act. However, we do disagree with the report that the government soldiers inflicted, human rights abuses on the South Sudanese that they are protecting. So we disagree with that.
Well, we'll get back to that point in a moment, but first let's hear...
It says it's government militia that are allies to the government, and we don't have any militia.
All right, we'll come back to that point in a moment, but let's just first go to Mike Lewis and get your immediate response to the report.
Well, I think one of the things that came out most strongly from my last visit to South Sudan last week is that the geography and the nature of the conflict is changing very fast. The places that were previously quite peaceful are seeing considerable levels of violence and the spread of the human problems that go along with it. So I think whatever the accounting is for past atrocities and crimes that have taken place in the past 2 years and before that, the books can't be closed now. There are new events and new problems emerging in parts of the country that previously the international community hasn't really been focused on.
Well, Rupert Colville, we heard the immediate denial there from the spokesman for the president, and we will get back to him. But your report makes apparent or suggests that this is a strategy being conducted from the highest possible level. Would you agree that that is what the report is saying?
Well, it certainly seemed the prevalence, the wide scale, the types of, particularly in the sexual violence on the women and girls, which is truly horrendous, is on such a scale, and the patterns are very similar. So it does appear to be much more than just random abuses, that it appears to be part of a deliberate strategy to terrorize the civilian population. In many senses, it's worked. 2 million people have been displaced. Whole areas devastated. If you add on to that the physical destruction, so you have a town like Malakal, well, something like 10,000 residences, huts, houses have been destroyed in Malakal. It's massive destruction. This is not just sort of collateral damage in fighting. This appears to be far more systematic. And that brings it up into the levels of the most serious crimes, war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Well, Ateny, just moving aside from this specific report for a short while, Amnesty International has also issued a report in recent days in which it says that over 60 people were intentionally allowed to suffocate in a trailer. It quoted more than 20 witnesses who said that government soldiers were responsible. There does appear to be some kind of wider pattern here to any impartial observer.
We condemn that particular crime against innocent civilians, but the government soldiers has no reason to kill the civilian and suffocate the civilian in which they are constitutionally well placed to protect. Our forces are actually engaging under strict orders to observe the rule of engagement, and that they have to protect civilians and make sure that when they are actually fighting with the other group that are attacking them, they must observe that to minimize the civilian casualties. And that particular incident is not the government soldiers doing that, because the government has no reason to lock the children and the women on the container.
Well, Ateny, if I may just follow up on this particular issue, though. We take your denials at face value. However, according to the overwhelming evidence that we are seeing, then you do have rogue elements within your army, it would appear, given these detailed allegations that are being made.
We don't say that we don't rule out the fact that some individuals, in any army, can come out and take law into their own hand. But the rules of engagement that our army observed is not allowing them to harm the civilian in whatever way, and that's why I'm saying I'm disagreeing with the fact that the government, the fingers are pointed on government to have been the one perpetrated the crime. In Unity State, there are a number of militia that are actually operating there. Some of them, you will find them in a military fatigue similar to that of the SPLA. However, they are not related to the SPLA completely. And if there are evidence, as government, we are actually taking any report seriously. We investigate the report, but if there are people who are actually ready to give us the evidence that is crucial, we will take those individuals who have committed crimes to the court of law.
Mike Lewis, you mentioned the way in which the geographical nature of this conflict has changed. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, the way that the UN and the international community used to describe the situation in South Sudan was in terms of what they called red and green states. Green states, places that were comparatively peaceful, and red states, the sort of epicenter of the conflict since 2013, particularly in the east and the north of the country. That situation has really changed significantly in the last 6 to 12 months. That areas, for example, to the west of the country, up against the border with Congo and the Central African Republic, where myself and a colleague were last week, are seeing new groups whose alignment to the major parties of the conflict is as yet unclear, emerging in a number of parts of the country. So what we see is a dispersion of the conflict, and what we also see is older and much longer standing groups and grievances beginning to get involved. One of the things we were looking at is so-called Arrow Boy groups. So these are groups that were initially aligned with the government to defend communities against the predations of the Lord's Resistance Army, who are now fighting government forces for their own claims and their own grievances. So in many different parts of the country, we're seeing this kind of fragmentation, and that's one of the reasons why it's important that that the books aren't closed on what's happened in the past. That this is a conflict that continues to evolve.
Well, Rupert, Colville, do your researchers, those who actually were investigating this over this long period of time, did they find that this fragmentation that Mike was just mentioning there is in fact a consequence of strategy once again, rather than a consequence of widespread conflict?
I'm not sure the fragmentation is a consequence of strategy. I think it's a fact of life. I agree absolutely with Mike. And the report that's come out today is, it's a snapshot, I would say, a large snapshot, but it's particularly focused on Unity State and then 3 other states, Upper Nile and Western and Central Equatoria. But it by no means covers the whole country. And I think for viewers, you need to understand South Sudan is an enormous country. It's about the size of France and Belgium put together. No roads at all, no tarmac roads outside the capital, not even very many in the capital. Very, very hard country to find out what's going on everywhere. So I think despite the litany of awful details that are in this report, it's by no means the whole picture. And yes, there are a kind of kaleidoscope of groups and shifting alliances and long historical enmities, and there's a whole separate story going on with cattle raiding. That's a major part of the conflict. Cattle are an extremely important part of the local economy. And both government forces and groups allied with the government forces and opposition forces throughout the last 2.5 years have been, raiding cattle from each other, raiding women from each other, treating women as a commodity, and slaughtering each other. And I think the report, in a sense, is focused more on the government side, but that's simply because of the time period it covers and the geography it's covering. But the opposition forces have also committed atrocious crimes since this conflict began at the end of 2013.
Ateny, to what extent are we seeing deep elements of racism here, tribal differences? Many of the targets that have been documented in the UN report, for example, are Nuer. The predominant tribe within South Sudan is Dinka. The president is a Dinka. The man that is leading the rebel movement, Riek Machar, is Nuer at the moment. Is this something that lies underneath this ongoing conflict and underneath attempts to gain control of territory through whatever means?
This is a clear misinterpretation to what it means by tribe in South Sudan. and total misunderstanding of our particular situation. The fact that President come from Dinka is a coincidence, and the fact that the rebel leader comes from Nuer is also another coincidence. Nobody has made it that a Dinka should be the president and the Nuer should be the rebels. What is actually known is the fact that this government is an SPLM-led government, and SPLM has a history of a liberation movement that has liberated this country from Sudan. And when it gains independence from Sudan, the problem is started within the SPLM, and so it's a problem of the SPLM. And this is a political problem that we can take it, and even us as people of South Sudan, we do understand that this is a political problem. It doesn't have anything to do with being this tribe or that tribe. Our tribe are our strength, but those who come to describe us are the ones who are actually dividing us. They are the ones who are telling us how we should be called when it comes to political differences. Of course, there are challenges that some politicians are actually relying on their tribes to achieve political goals. But the truth of the matter is that we have lived longer before, before the creation of what is called South Sudan politically. The Dinka were living along Nuers, and the Nuer were living along Dinka, the Shuluk, and vice versa. The colonization are the one who came, the colonial masters are the one who came and tried to bank on the issue of our tribes. But our tribe are our strength, and we respect each other. We lived side by side, and this goes to the misunderstanding, that the people who comes to acquainting themselves about our history, they don't get that we are one people, and even if we differ politically, it cannot threat this country to fragment on the basis of our ethnicities.
Well, let me go to Mike Lewis, if I may. Am I misunderstanding? Am I oversimplifying the situation, Mike Lewis?
I think certainly what we found in the western part of the country underscores that this is no longer simply the kind of caricatured Nuer-Dinka conflict that we've heard of in the past. We see much more localized grievances, much more localized groups, and groups also with international or at least regional connections. One of the things my organization does is look at where different parties to the conflict are getting their weapons from. Nearly half of the weaponries we saw that had been captured from Araboy groups in the west of the country in the last few weeks are older weapons that match those we've seen being circulated amongst civilians in the Central African Republic and in Darfur in North Sudan. And I think what that underlines for me is that there are circuits of conflict resources and also connections of groups and grievances that are a long way from that caricature of Nuer and Dinka. However real that those kinds of ethnic tensions are, of course.
Well, Rupert Colville, there has been criticism of the UN's role in this. Some have contended the UN is simply not doing enough to intercede between these warring groups, and the UN report itself makes very clear the consequences of this ongoing conflict. Is there anything more the UN can do, or is it something that those within the country itself have got to resolve for themselves?
Well, I think both. I mean, yeah, ultimately the country itself has to resolve it. The UN can't sort of completely impose peace, and it can't impose harmony, and it can't impose good governance. It can prod, and it can offer to help, and it can do a certain amount. I think when you see killings and rapes on this kind of scale, it's really important that the international community sends very, very strong signals, particularly to the leadership on both sides, that this has to stop. And we've been saying that for years, and it hasn't stopped. If anything, it's getting worse. So I think, there is a peace plan, in a sense, on the table. And there's supposed to be a transitional national government of unity. A transitional government of national unity. But it's still not up and running. It's still not operating. And then, you know, it's going to be very hard. So I think the international community has to support as much as it can, but it also needs to make it very clear to those in power in South Sudan that this cannot continue, and there must be accountability. You can't have killings and rapes and murders and destruction on this kind of scale simply going on and on and on, and no one's responsible, no one's held to blame, no one's held to account. That simply just feeds the crisis, and you're in a kind of vicious cycle here, and you'll get more cycles in 5 or 10 years if there's not really quite a radical change in the situation in South Sudan.
Well, Ateny, many have argued that this crisis can only be resolved if the transitional government is formed. What is holding up the formation of this transitional government, which would appear to be the key to ending these horrendous reports that we are seeing?
The President of the Republic, Salva Kiir Mayardit, has actually put in place all the measures of, to form all the preparation to form the government of national unity. And you might have heard last week he actually gave Dr. Riek Machar, the first vice president designate, to return to South Sudan within 7 days so that they can form together the government of national unity, which is known as Tegeno. And Dr. Riek did not turn up in Juba. He's still actually traveling from country to country. And while we urge, we wait for Dr. Riek Machar, we urge the international community to let Riek Machar come back to Juba as quickly as possible so that we sit and form the government of national unity in order to alleviate our people from the suffering, because implementation of peace agreement is the only way out. And we want to show to the world that, people of South Sudan are capable to solve their own problems. When Dr. Riek Machar come and sit together with President Salva Kiir for the second time, because this is not the first time for the two men to work, you will see that those who are actually helping us, if they have good intention to help South Sudanese solve their problem, they would see us, coming, together for the purpose of making this country to pull together.
Well, Mike Lewis, it seems that the longer this conflict continues, the more difficult it is going to be to resolve politically. What do you think can be done to try and short-circuit it, to try and get some kind of political resolution, which would appear to be the only way of ending the current wave of conflict?
Well, I mean, I'd echo what your other guests have said about the fact that a political solution is only one that is going to be found by the South Sudanese people. It's absolutely not for people like me, or indeed members of the international community, to define or to describe what that political solution would look like. Where I think the international community can play a role, as Mr. Colville was saying, is in ensuring that there is accountability and investigation for what has happened in the past. Myself and a colleague were in Malakal a couple of weeks ago, just days after a serious bout of fighting within the UN base there, where tens of thousands of civilians have been sheltering. Over 20 people were killed, hundreds wounded, and about 20,000 people displaced out of the camp. And for at least a week after those events, the site itself wasn't really secured. There wasn't forensic or certainly ballistic investigations of places where there had been fighting and shooting. And if we fall short in our duty to document and investigate really what's going on on the doorstep of where the international community is present in South Sudan, then I think we're not helping any of the process to move forward.
Well, at that particular point, we come to an end. Thanks to all our guests, Ateny, Mike Lewis, and Rupert Colville. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mike Hanna, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.